Why did this dog stand in the middle of traffic, refusing to move, refusing to leave, as if he was waiting for someone he could trust? Not food, not a home, but something deeper. Someone who could understand his eyes. What he led them to would change 4 lives, and maybe yours too. The traffic light at the intersection of Broad and King Streets had been green for over 20 seconds, but no car moved. Horns honked in frustrated bursts. Drivers craned their necks out of their windows, faces contorted with impatience. Charleston wasn't known for gridlock, especially not in the early hours of a crisp October morning, when the streets usually held a certain calm grace. Until today. Miles Corbin shifted slightly in the driver's seat of his forest green Buick. The vehicle, though old, was kept immaculate, just like its owner. At 62, Miles still bore the presence of a man who had once been a police officer. His tall, lean frame held a certain rigidity, and his silver hair was combed neatly back. His brown eyes were sharp but tired, the kind of tired that came not from sleepless nights but from years of watching too much change and too many people disappear. Since losing his wife, Miriam, 4 winters ago, Miles had lived alone in a modest white brick house in West Ashley. He no longer wore his badge, but discipline clung to him like a second skin. He tapped the steering wheel once, then opened the door. People were out of their cars now, murmuring and gathering toward the middle of the intersection. Miles walked with long strides, his black coat brushing against his knees. And then he saw it. In the very center of the road stood a large German shepherd, its stance alert but not aggressive. The dog was lean but muscular, with a coat of classic black and tan. One ear stood tall, the other drooped slightly, perhaps from an old injury. Its amber eyes were wide, watchful, not with fear, but something more. Deliberate. The dog didn't flinch as cars beeped or doors slammed. It simply stood, gazing down the eastern street, then turning to glance back at the crowd, as if waiting for someone to understand. "Somebody call animal control?" a man asked. "They're gonna put him down," another muttered. That thought didn't sit right with Miles. He crouched slowly, maintaining eye contact. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly. "What are you doing here, huh?" The dog didn't move away. If anything, it leaned slightly forward, a faint whimper escaping its throat. It wasn't lost. It wasn't feral. It was trying to say something. 10 minutes later, with the situation cleared and traffic grudgingly restored, Miles opened the back seat of his Buick. The German shepherd leapt in without hesitation. Back home, Miles led the dog inside. His house was quiet, filled with relics of a life once vibrant. Miriam's teacups still neatly arranged in the kitchen hutch, a faded photograph of her on the piano, and a folded American flag on the mantel. The dog sniffed cautiously but didn't pace. Instead, it sat in the living room, looking directly at Miles with an unnerving calm. "What's your name?" Miles asked, though he didn't expect an answer. "You're not just some stray." When he reached toward the collar, the dog didn't resist. Around its neck was a leather strap that had seen better days, and hanging from it was a small scratched silver tag. It wasn't from the city shelter. On the inside, etched in tiny font, were numbers. Coordinates, perhaps, but also a small embedded medical alert device. Miles frowned. He picked up the phone and dialed an old number. "Elijah," he said. On the other end, Dr. Elijah Burke, 54, a broad-shouldered man with a perpetually wrinkled lab coat and reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose, answered from his veterinary clinic. Elijah had once served with Miles in the Marines before becoming a specialist in animal rehabilitation. He was methodical and deeply empathetic, a man more comfortable with dogs than people. Miles gave him the code etched on the tag. "That's not ours," Elijah said after a pause. "That's not a city code. Wait, that's a medical locator. Human medical alert. Sometimes used in elder care facilities." Miles's brow creased. "What the hell's a dog doing with one of those?" "That," Elijah replied, "is the right question." As Miles hung up the phone, the dog, no, Orion, he decided, watched him with an unsettling intensity, as if it had been waiting for the right person all along. Across the street, from a second-story balcony adorned with wind chimes and potted succulents, a boy stood gripping the railing. He had sandy hair, cut unevenly like it had been done at home, and wore a hoodie 2 sizes too big. He was still, unnaturally still for a 13-year-old. This was Caleb Jensen, a quiet boy who had stopped speaking altogether after the death of his parents a year ago. Diagnosed with high-functioning autism, Caleb now lived with his older sister, Clara Jensen, a 30-year-old freelance illustrator. Clara was slender, with auburn hair usually tied in a messy bun, and kind eyes tinged with exhaustion. She had given up a job offer in Atlanta to raise Caleb in Charleston, hoping a slower life might help him heal. From the balcony, Caleb saw Orion. The moment their eyes met, something shifted. Clara came outside, holding a sketchbook. "Hey, Caleb," she said gently. "What you looking at?" Caleb pointed, and then for the first time in weeks, he smiled. Down below, Miles noticed them and offered a small nod. A few hours later, Clara knocked on his door. "Hi," she began, slightly breathless. "I'm sorry to intrude, but my brother Caleb, he saw your dog earlier, and he's been drawing him nonstop. He doesn't usually connect with anyone or anything. Not like this." Miles glanced back at Orion, who was now lying calmly in the corner, head resting on his front paws. "You want to say hi?" he asked. Clara hesitated. "Could we?" Inside, Caleb sat on the floor beside Orion, who allowed the boy to gently stroke his fur without flinching. The connection between them was instant, wordless. Clara's voice softened. "This is rare, thank you." Miles didn't quite know what to say, so he nodded. "Seems this dog's full of surprises." As the evening settled in and the autumn air cooled the room, Miles sat back in his recliner. Orion rested near the fire, one eye half open, the other seemingly keeping watch. There was a sense, deep in Miles's bones, that this was no ordinary rescue. This dog hadn't stumbled into his life by accident. And somewhere out there, someone might be in danger. Someone who had counted on Orion to bring help. Miles stared into the embers, and Orion stared at him. Neither of them blinked. The morning sun broke across the Charleston skyline with a golden hush, filtering softly through the front windows of Miles Corbin's home. The old man stood at his kitchen counter, pouring himself a black cup of coffee, eyes flicking occasionally toward the quiet shape stretched across the worn rug near the fireplace. Orion, ever watchful even in rest, opened one amber eye when Miles shifted. The dog had slept by the door all night, unmoving as if guarding something. There was something dignified about the creature, 3 years old, no doubt still in his prime, but his stillness spoke of a discipline that went beyond breed or training. That partially torn ear, the slight scar under the jawline, the way his eyes never darted randomly but tracked with purpose. It all said he'd seen things, been through something. Maybe he had a story all his own. Miles took a long sip of his coffee and walked over. "Guess we're not done with each other yet, huh?" He kneeled and lifted the collar again. The tag still bore the same faintly etched numbers, worn smooth by time and motion. He snapped a quick photo and pulled out his old phone. With a grumble of hesitation, he opened the contact list, a skeleton crew of names, many long outdated, and found the number for the precinct. He called. The voice that answered was younger, polite but sharp. "Charleston Metro Police, Officer Delgado speaking." "This is Miles Corbin," he said, with that slow, level voice that used to get confessions before suspects knew they were talking. "Retired. Badge number 4817. I'm trying to ID a medical tracking number tied to what I believe may be a missing person. I've got a dog here, German Shepherd, male, about 3 years old, who showed up wearing it." There was a pause, the clacking of a keyboard. "Medical ID?" "Etched onto a collar. Code matches the formatting I've seen from elder care alert systems." Another pause, then, "Sir, we do have a missing person report out of Glenroe Assisted Living. Name is Robert Hensley, 72, former public school teacher, missing 2 days, heart condition, early signs of vascular dementia." Miles straightened, his hand tightening around the receiver. "Was there any mention of a dog?" "Yes, actually. Staff said he had been in a therapy program involving a dog named Orion, but the dog was relocated to a state-run kennel after budget cuts. Mr. Hensley took it badly, tried to leave the facility twice. The second time, he was nearly successful." Miles glanced at Orion. "He wasn't successful the third time." "No, sir, not officially. Can you send me his file?" There was another long pause. Then Officer Delgado said, "Unofficially, check your inbox in 5 minutes." True to his word, a PDF arrived moments later. Miles opened it on his old laptop, blurry ID photos, scanned incident reports, and in one attached note, a grainy image of Robert Hensley seated on a bench, smiling faintly, his hand resting on the thick fur of a familiar German shepherd. "I'll be damned," Miles muttered. Across the street, in their two-bedroom apartment above the florist's shop, Clara Jensen watched her younger brother draw. Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor by the balcony door, his sketchbook balanced across his knees. At 13, Caleb had the slight frame of someone who never quite trusted the world to hold him, but his fingers moved with confidence, pencil racing across the page in clean, focused strokes. Clara leaned closer. The page was filled with motion, Orion mid-stride, his tail curved, ears alert. But what stunned her most was the emotion captured in the dog's eyes. Caleb had drawn compassion. And more astonishing still, recognition. Clara, 30 years old, had always been the quieter of two siblings. She'd inherited their father's angular cheekbones, their mother's freckled skin, and a weary kind of resilience. A talented illustrator, she had once been poised for a big publishing deal before her parents' accident. She had canceled everything, moved cities, and folded her entire life into raising her brother. And now, for the first time in months, he wasn't lost in silence or obsession. He was connected. Clara quietly wiped at her eye. She picked up her phone. At the veterinary center off Lockwood Drive, Dr. Elijah Burke was already reviewing the message Miles had forwarded. Elijah was in his mid-50s, stout, with thinning hair, and a beard that had long surrendered to gray. His demeanor was careful, deliberate, like someone who knew both the fragility of animals and the brokenness of people. He picked up his office line and dialed a number he had long memorized. "Annie?" he asked. The woman who answered had a voice like morning gravel and strong coffee. Nurse Annie Westbrook, 41, was sharp-eyed, soft-spoken, and always slightly disheveled in her scrubs. Her history with Elijah was long. They'd both worked in animal-assisted therapy trials, and she'd recently transferred to Glenroe Assisted Living. "Yes, Elijah?" "I've got a question about a missing patient of yours, Robert Hensley." A pause, then a sigh. "What about him?" "Elijah, is it true he was in therapy with a German shepherd named Orion?" "Yes. It was the only thing that helped him stabilize. After the dog was removed, he began to deteriorate fast. He tried to leave twice." "Why didn't they assign him another dog?" "Budget, new administration, you know how it goes." Elijah rubbed his temples. "I think I found Orion." There was a rustling sound, as if Annie had sat down heavily. Then her voice, quiet. "That old man always said if he could just find Orion, he'd be okay. That he didn't need pills or staff. Just the dog." There was silence between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Then Annie added, "I still have his therapy journal. I shouldn't, but I couldn't throw it away." "Does it say anything useful?" "A sketch," she said. "A hand-drawn map. I thought it was nonsense, some trail behind the facility. Maybe a fantasy. I need a copy. I'll send it." That night, Miles stared at the printed map on his kitchen table. It was crude, drawn in pen on a piece of lined paper, but the landmarks were real: trees, a stream, an overgrown trail. At the bottom, in shaky writing, were the words, "If I get lost, he'll find the way. I trust Orion." Miles didn't sleep much that night. The air was colder. Outside, Orion sat by the front door, as if waiting again, as if still listening, as if they both knew something wasn't right. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of city lights, in the quiet that only the forgotten know, a man may still be waiting for his dog. The air was crisp when Miles pulled his old Buick into the narrow gravel lot just outside Riverside Park. The sun was still low, casting long, slanted shadows between the trees, and the fog had yet to fully lift from the wooded paths that twisted beyond the parking lot like veins of memory. Orion sat in the passenger seat, silent, ears perked forward. He hadn't taken his eyes off the tree line since they turned off the main road. Riverside Park wasn't the sort of place tourists visited. It didn't have the painted gazebos or curated flower beds of the city's better-known green spaces. This place was older, quieter, an unassuming patch of trees and trails that only locals remembered, and even then, just vaguely. But when Miles had laid Robert Hensley's hand-drawn map over a printout of Charleston's old park maps the night before, the landmarks had lined up perfectly. Dr. Elijah Burke parked his gray pickup beside Miles and stepped out, rubbing his gloved hands together. He wore his usual canvas jacket, one elbow patched, and a wide-brimmed cap pulled low over thinning salt and pepper hair. A duffel bag hung from one shoulder, filled with supplies he insisted on bringing, just in case. Orion hopped from the car without needing a command. The German shepherd trotted ahead, nose low to the ground, tail held steady. Not wagging, not stiff, focused. Miles followed silently, letting the dog guide. Elijah came up beside him. "You're sure about this?" "No," Miles said, "but he is." The three moved into the trees where the trail quickly narrowed, becoming less a path and more a suggestion. Orion slowed occasionally, sniffing the air, then continued, weaving between ferns and broken branches, deeper into the undergrowth. After 20 minutes, they reached a clearing choked with yellowing grass and leaf litter. At the far end, a gnarled sycamore tree stood like a sentinel, its bark cracked and peeling like old skin. Orion stopped there. His ears twitched, and he sniffed at the base of the tree, then looked back at Miles and gave a soft, urgent bark. Just once. Burke knelt beside him. He found something. Scattered near the roots were fragments: a crumpled napkin, a plastic water bottle, a corner of bread dried out and stale, and most startling of all, a folded piece of paper, partially hidden beneath a patch of moss. Burke plucked it up gently and unfolded it. The ink had bled from dew, but the message was still legible. "If Orion finds someone, follow him. Please." Miles stared at the note for a long beat. "Robert wrote this." Elijah nodded grimly. "And he left it here. That means he was here. Recently." Miles scanned the area, then crouched beside the tree. There were shallow footprints, half erased by time, some pointing inward, others outward. A direction. Orion circled once, then patted east, tail flicking once as if to say, "This way." Across town, in the sun-drenched living room of the Jensen apartment, Caleb sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, completely absorbed. Pencils of varying lengths were scattered around him, and a blank canvas leaned against the wall. He wasn't speaking, but his fingers moved with purpose. Clara watched him from the kitchen, arms crossed, a dish towel still slung over one shoulder. She had always admired the way Caleb saw the world. Fragmented, yes, but through angles that others couldn't comprehend. His drawings had always carried strange accuracy, especially for places he'd never visited. But this was different. Today's drawing was a forest. Densely packed trees, a crooked path, and in the center, a sycamore tree, large and weathered, with Orion sitting beneath it. The bark was scarred, the roots thick and protruding like veins beneath the ground. And at the base, Caleb had drawn a piece of paper fluttering beneath a breeze. Clara swallowed. She picked up her phone and called Miles. When he didn't answer, she texted instead. "Caleb's drawing something. He's never seen that park. But it matches what you told me. It's strange." "Do you think he's remembering something through the dog, or through Robert?" She didn't expect a reply right away, but her fingers trembled slightly as she set the phone down. Meanwhile, Miles and Burke followed Orion down the narrowing trail. The further they went, the less defined the path became. Thorns snagged at clothing, and low-hanging branches scraped at their shoulders. "I used to run these woods when I was 12, Elijah muttered, "back when they weren't swallowed up by time." Miles grunted. "They've got that feel now, like they don't want to be remembered." Orion halted again, near a shallow ditch beside a broken fence that looked like it had once been part of a property boundary. This time, there were clearer signs: a shred of flannel fabric clinging to a nail on a post, a partial boot print still visible in the damp soil. Miles crouched and studied it. Men's size 10 or 11, heavy tread, could be hiking boots, not old. Elijah pulled out a small flashlight and scanned the ground. "Look, over there." A cluster of pressed-down grass, and beside it, a faint red smear on a fallen branch. Not fresh, but not old either. Burke bent closer and sniffed. "Blood," he said. "A few days, maybe." Miles looked at Orion, who had now moved a few paces ahead and was standing perfectly still, ears tilted forward, tail low. His body had gone taut, alert. Miles reached for his phone to call in a ranger unit, but before he could dial, a faint sound echoed through the trees. It was the dry snap of twigs breaking. Burke held up a hand. Both men froze. Orion didn't bark. Instead, He stepped back beside Miles, pressing against his leg. Whatever was ahead, the dog wasn't afraid, but he was wary. The noise stopped. A bird fluttered out of a bush. Silence returned. Elijah exhaled slowly. Maybe just wildlife. Or maybe something worse, Miles murmured. They turned back, heading to mark the path, and agreed to return with better gear and a medical team if needed. That evening, Nurse Annie Westbrook stood alone in the Glenroe Staff Library, a dim room filled with outdated medical textbooks and stacks of unused pamphlets. She flipped through Robert's old therapy journal, one she'd kept hidden behind the nurse's station even after administrators had ordered all personal materials discarded. In the final pages, Robert's handwriting grew slanted, uneven, and then one note stood out, circled in blue ink. Orion isn't just a dog, he's the eyes of hope. When my words fade, he remembers them. When my feet fail, he walks them. Annie, always composed, felt something loosen in her chest. She folded the journal and whispered, "Come back, Robert. We're all still here." Night fell over Charleston, quiet and cool. At Miles's house, Orion sat by the door again, as if waiting for someone to understand the message he couldn't speak. The wind had picked up, rustling the dying leaves above the trail with a low, whispering cadence. Miles and Dr. Elijah Burke moved cautiously through the thicket, their boots crunching softly against damp foliage. Orion trotted ahead with silent purpose, his posture alert, nose to the ground, tail held low but steady. They had marked the path carefully that morning, using orange ribbons and chalk along trees, having sensed they were close. They returned now with backpacks, a field radio, a basic trauma kit, and renewed tension in their chests. Something in Orion's demeanor told Miles they were near something more than footprints and faded breadcrumbs. The dog's movements had grown more insistent, more focused, as though the trail itself now whispered the name of the one they sought. "Stop," Elijah said, holding up a hand. "You hear that?" They stood still. Below the wind, beneath the ambient hum of the forest, a faint sound rose, the trickle of water. Not a stream, but more deliberate, a place where water pooled, and nearby, wood creaked. "A bridge," Miles murmured. "Must be one of the old ones. Haven't seen it on the city maps in years." They followed the sound, moving toward a cluster of trees where the forest thinned slightly. There, barely holding together under the weight of time, stood an old wooden bridge, moss-covered and hunched over a narrow ravine. Beneath it ran a thin, shallow creek, cutting through stone like a whispered scar. The air grew colder in its presence. Orion stood at the foot of the bridge, paws planted firmly. He barked once, not loud, but urgent. Miles peered over the edge. "There's something down there," he said, voice tightening. "A tarp, maybe? No, clothing?" Elijah was already climbing down the bank, grabbing onto exposed roots and jagged stones. "Stay back until I call," he said. Miles held Orion's collar gently. The dog didn't struggle, but his body quivered with contained energy. Elijah reached the creek bed, his boots splashing slightly. He stepped around a curve of rock and gasped. There, partially obscured by the fallen limbs of an old cypress tree, lay a man. Thin, motionless, curled slightly on one side. His gray hair was matted, his clothes torn and damp. A makeshift bed of leaves and a jacket had been gathered beneath him. One leg was twisted unnaturally. "Robert!" Elijah shouted, rushing forward and dropping to his knees. At the sound, the man stirred, a faint moan, barely a breath. Then, slowly he turned his head. His face was pale, sunken, lips cracked. But his eyes opened, and in that dim, hollow gaze, recognition flickered. "You found someone, boy," Robert Hensley whispered, his voice hoarse but filled with something like triumph. "You did it!" Orion barked again, and this time Miles let him go. The German shepherd leapt down the slope with the ease of a creature half wild and entirely driven. He skidded to a halt beside Robert and pressed his head gently against the man's arm, nuzzling with care. Robert reached out, hand trembling, fingers brushing against the soft fur, like a man grounding himself in reality. "He's alive," Elijah called up. "Broken femur, dehydrated, but conscious." Miles radioed it in immediately. "This is Corbin. We have a positive locate. Male, 72, responsive, requesting medevac at the old Riverside Bridge. Coordinates transmitting now." Back at the Jensen apartment, Clara sat cross-legged on the floor beside Caleb. The living room was quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the soft scratch of pencils across paper. Caleb was drawing again, but this time the scene was different. It was beneath a bridge, a small man curled in a pocket of trees, a stream beside him. And there was Orion, lying at his side. Clara's breath caught. The details were too precise. Caleb had never seen this bridge, never been to Riverside. And yet the way he captured the curve of the hill, the shape of the rocks, even the folds of Robert's jacket, it was like he had felt them. Clara reached for Caleb's journal, the one he rarely let her touch. She flipped through page after page of sketches, each one showing Orion in some act of alertness, some moment of tension, guiding, leading, finding. And among the pages, she found something else, scribbled notes in the margins, not full sentences, just words. Cold. Fell. He waits. Pain in leg. Orion goes. She looked up at her brother, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb, are you drawing what Orion feels, or what Robert feels? Caleb didn't answer. He only smiled faintly, then added a patch of yellow light to the sky above the bridge. At the scene, Annie Westbrook knelt beside Elijah, her bag open, hands moving with efficiency. She had arrived in the emergency truck, having insisted to the dispatcher that if they found Robert, she needed to be there. Annie's auburn hair was tied back in a messy braid, and her tired face was taut with focus. She worked in silence, checking vitals, administering fluids, supporting the fractured leg with a splint. Her voice softened only when she leaned in close. Robert, she said, brushing back his damp hair. It's Annie. I'm here now. His eyelids fluttered. You said Orion would find someone, she whispered. You were right. He opened his eyes barely, but they glistened. Told you. He's Hope, he rasped. Hope with 4 legs. Orion lay curled against Robert's side, tail curled around his body, chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm with the old man's breath. It took another 30 minutes for the stretcher to be lowered. The ravine made the extraction difficult, but the team worked together in practiced silence. When Robert was finally lifted, his hand never let go of Orion's fur until the very last second. Miles stood above them, hands on his hips, chest tight with relief. Elijah came to stand beside him, shaking his head. I don't know what's more unbelievable, Burke said, that Robert survived out here for days, or that Orion brought us straight to him. Miles glanced down at the dog, who now sat on the trail, watching the stretcher disappear between the trees. Maybe we've got the whole thing backwards, he said quietly. Maybe we didn't find him. Maybe Orion found us. Elijah said nothing, but he didn't disagree. That night, as the medics wheeled Robert through the emergency bay doors, Annie walked beside the gurney, hand on his shoulder. In her other hand, she carried Robert's therapy journal, worn and water-damaged, but still intact. Later, she'd open it and write a single new line on the last page. He was right. Orion remembers, and we will too. The beeping monitors in room 207 of Charleston General pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm, comforting in their consistency. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of coffee from the nurse's station just outside. Robert Hensley lay in bed, propped up on white pillows, the blanket pulled over a cast that encased his right leg. He looked older now, even more so than before, skin a touch more translucent, eyes a little sunken. But there was life in his voice again. Sitting in the visitor chair beside him was Miles Corbin, dressed in his usual navy jacket, cap still in his hands. Orion rested quietly on the floor beside the bed, one paw stretched forward, head up, ears alert but relaxed. I didn't train him the way they teach in the manuals, Robert said after a long sip of water. His voice, though raspy, carried a certain teacherly rhythm, the echo of years spent in front of chalkboards and curious young minds. I never thought of it as training, really. It was more permission. Miles raised an eyebrow. Permission? Robert smiled faintly. To notice things, to act on them. I didn't want him to just respond to commands. I wanted him to feel, to recognize need. Not just bark when someone cried out, but to sense it before it was spoken. He reached down slowly, his fingers brushing the top of Orion's head. The dog looked up and exhaled softly, closing his eyes. I used behavior shaping, basic reinforcement, but I paired it with something else. When I was weak, I let him see it. When I was lonely, I told him. And when others were suffering in silence around us, he started finding them before I even noticed. You created a therapy dog, Miles said. I created a mirror, Robert replied, with pause. There was a pause. Outside the window, golden autumn light filtered through the thin hospital curtains. Leaves danced in gusts across the pavement. Robert turned his gaze back to Miles. He was meant to be retired when the funding dried up. I knew it would break him, being locked in a shelter. So when I left the center, I took the only thing that could still listen. Miles nodded slowly. You didn't just send him out to survive? I sent him to find someone, Robert whispered. I told him to follow where it hurt. Later that afternoon, Clara arrived at Miles's house with a small folder in hand. She looked tired but composed, her long red coat catching bits of wind as she walked up the porch steps. Her hazel eyes searched Miles's with quiet intensity. I wanted you to see these, she said simply. Inside the folder were 5 charcoal sketches, all done by Caleb. The style was unmistakable, expressive, deliberate. One showed Orion standing between an elderly man and a young boy, both with closed eyes but identical expressions of peace. Another showed Orion at the center of a ring of faint silhouettes, some hunched in wheelchairs, others seated cross-legged, all facing him. And then the last, Orion with Miles, the dog's eyes drawn with an almost human intensity, like he saw everything. He's never drawn you before, Clara said quietly, or Robert. Not like this. Caleb says he dreams of Orion walking between places, connecting people. Miles ran a calloused thumb along the edge of the drawing. It's like he sees something we don't. Clara hesitated. Orion isn't just reacting to emotions. He's reflecting them. Caleb's sensitivity, his gift, it picked that up. Orion doesn't just feel. He listens so deeply it changes the room. There was a pause. You've let him listen to you, haven't you? She asked. Miles didn't answer with words. He just nodded once, slowly. That evening, Burke arrived at the hospital, his shoulders dusted with wind-blown leaves. He carried a slim folder, his name embroidered faintly on the corner of his tan coat. Inside were documents, applications, letters of recommendation, and one proposal. Charleston's starting a pilot program, he told Robert and Annie in the room. Animal-assisted cognitive therapy. They want a flagship figure, a story to ground it. And you want Orion, Robert said, his voice calm. Not just for photos, Burke said. For people, for the ones falling through cracks. He's a proven responder. He's more than a therapy dog. He's a bridge. But he'll need a handler, Annie interjected gently. Someone who can work with both people and animals. Someone Orion already trusts. Robert turned toward Miles, who stood near the doorway, arms crossed. Annie continued. We all know Orion's not going to connect with just anyone. He follows purpose. And right now, Miles, you're his. Miles looked between them. I'm not a therapist. No, Burke agreed. You're better. You're honest. You don't pretend to fix people. You just show up. There was a beat of silence before Robert chuckled softly. He won't just guard you, Miles. He'll carry you forward, like he did for me. Miles looked down at Orion. The dog was watching him already, that familiar silent understanding pulsing through the air like a low drum beat. And in that moment, something shifted. Not an obligation. A calling. I'll do it, he said. Later that night, after visiting hours had ended, Robert sat alone with Orion in the dimly lit hospital room. The city's hum echoed beyond the walls. Cars in the distance, sirens far off. Orion lay beside the bed again, eyes half-lidded. Robert leaned down and whispered, You found someone again, didn't you, boy? Orion didn't move. But this time, Robert said, maybe you found the right one. He closed his eyes, fingers still tangled in Orion's fur. Outside the room, Annie stood quietly with a clipboard, her smile gentle, the kind reserved for the rare moments when the world feels slightly healed. And in a nearby apartment, Caleb finished another drawing, this time of a bridge made of light, with a dog walking across it, guiding someone whose face was just beginning to form. The morning sunlight came softly through the lace curtains of Miles Corbin's living room, casting shadows across the worn hardwood floors. Orion sat near the front door, his posture relaxed but alert, ears tilted slightly forward, always listening. A leash hung loosely on the doorknob, Not because it was needed, Orion never bolted or wandered without cause, but because Miles believed in respecting structure, even when it wasn't necessary. It had been 2 weeks since Robert Hensley was found beneath the wooden bridge, and life, in its quiet and deliberate way, had begun to rearrange itself. Miles adjusted the collar on his button-up shirt, looking at himself in the hall mirror. He still wasn't used to wearing dress clothes again, not since retirement. But today was different. Today, the city had something to say. A knock on the door pulled him from his reflection. Clara stood outside, her hair in a neat braid for once, wearing a light cardigan over a pressed navy blouse. She carried a manila folder tucked under one arm, her usual calm demeanor, accompanied by the subtle nervous energy of someone standing at the edge of a new beginning. "Morning," she said. "I hope I'm not too early." "You're just in time," Miles replied, stepping aside. "Coffee's fresh if you want a cup." Clara smiled. "Only if there's cream." As she stepped inside, Caleb lingered behind her, hoodie sleeves pulled over his hands, eyes scanning the room. When he saw Orion, his expression shifted, relaxed, like the boy had just spotted something he'd been missing. Orion stood and padded over slowly, lowering his head so Caleb could reach without needing to ask. The boy knelt beside him, resting his cheek against the dog's shoulder, in a motion so instinctive and trusting that it felt almost sacred. "I brought Caleb's enrollment forms," Clara said, handing the folder to Miles. "Dr. Burke and Annie approved everything. He'll start observation days next week." Miles glanced through the pages. "Volunteer role?" "For now," she said. "But Burke hinted they might open a paid support position soon. I don't mind starting small." She looked around, her eyes lingering on the photographs lining the mantel. Miles with his late wife, a faded badge in a wooden frame, a picture of Orion taken just days ago, already printed and pinned up. "We've decided to stay in Charleston," she added softly. "Caleb, he's better here. I'm better here. We're not running anymore." Miles gave a small nod, his expression unreadable, but in the silence between them, there was understanding. Later that afternoon, a modest crowd gathered in front of Charleston City Hall, where folding chairs had been set out beneath a long white canopy. The mayor, a petite woman in her early 50s with a commanding presence and a sharp blazer the color of storm clouds, stood at the podium. Behind her, a banner read, "In honor of unspoken heroes, celebrating courage beyond command." Miles sat in the second row, Orion at his feet. The dog was freshly groomed, his black and tan coat gleaming in the autumn sun. A small medallion hung from his collar now, a city-issued emblem etched with a star and paw print. To the left of the stage sat Robert Hensley, still in a wheelchair, his leg in a brace, but color had returned to his cheeks. He wore a navy sweater and his old teaching watch, the one he hadn't worn in years. Annie stood behind him, arms folded gently, her face taut with emotion. Burke hovered nearby, notebook in hand, ready to jot observations even during a ceremony. That was just who he was, always learning, always planning the next step. When the mayor took the stage, her voice cut clean through the afternoon hum of wind and distant traffic. "There are moments," she began, "when what's done quietly matters more than what's done loudly. A man who left no note and a dog who spoke no word together changed how we define rescue." She paused, eyes scanning the crowd. Robert Hensley, retired educator, was found thanks to a German shepherd who was never trained as a rescue dog, but who knew, in the language only some creatures speak, that hope doesn't need permission. Polite applause followed, then grew stronger as Robert was wheeled to the edge of the stage, offering a slight bow of gratitude. "And then," the mayor continued, "there is Miles Corbin, a man who spent decades serving this city, and who, even in retirement, answered a call no siren marked, who followed a dog without knowing why, and in doing so, reminded us what it means to listen to something greater than protocol. Intuition, compassion, faith." She motioned to Miles. He didn't stand at first, never one for spotlights, but when Orion nudged him gently with a paw, he rose, stepped forward, and accepted the plaque in silence. The crowd stood, not clapping, just standing. Sometimes, the quietest honors are the loudest. Back at the veterinary clinic, Burke sat in his office reviewing papers. The walls around him were cluttered with books on animal cognition, framed degrees, and old photographs of therapy animals he had worked with across the years. Orion's picture had joined them now, centered between two black and white portraits of dogs from past decades. Annie entered with a cup of tea. She set it down beside his elbow and leaned against the doorframe. "You're really going forward with the expansion?" she asked. Burke nodded. "With Orion as the anchor, we can scale this properly. The pilot program proved it. We're calling it the Bridge Project. Emotional recovery support animals, trained not just to assist, but to listen. And not just in hospitals, schools, community centers, shelters." Annie's expression softened. "You'll need a team." "I've already started assembling one. Clara's on my list, and Caleb, when he's ready." "You forgot someone." Burke looked up. "Corbin," she said. "You'll need someone like him, not just for the dogs, but for the people who trust them." Burke nodded, making a note. "And you?" he asked. "Still running the evening shift?" Annie shrugged. "Someone's got to make sure your idealism doesn't forget to eat." They both chuckled quietly. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the oaks lining Miles's street, he stood on the back porch with Orion. The dog lay beside him, head on his paws, watching the breeze. Inside, the house felt fuller now. Clara's laughter from the kitchen as she joked with Caleb about grocery lists. Caleb's sketchbook left open on the couch with a half-finished drawing of Orion guiding a child through a foggy forest. Miles sipped a glass of water and looked down at the dog. "You're not mine," he said quietly, "but you're here, and maybe that's enough." Orion lifted his head, pressed his muzzle against Miles's leg, and let out a long, low breath. It was the sound of a dog who had walked miles for someone else, and stayed for someone new. The building that once held nothing more than storage rooms and unused offices had been transformed. Now the walls of Burke's community center were lined with bright art, soft textures, and the low hum of conversation. It didn't smell like antiseptic anymore. It smelled of coffee, crayons, and the warm musk of dogs. And in the very center of it all, Orion moved like a quiet force, weaving his way through each space with purpose. He wasn't led by a leash anymore. He didn't need one. He was guided by something deeper, a sense of direction that couldn't be taught. Every day, he stepped through the glass doors with Miles Corbin by his side, and every day he found someone who needed him. Miles had taken to wearing soft, neutral-colored clothes, dark jeans, flannel shirts rolled at the sleeves, a quiet uniform that helped him blend in, but made Orion stand out. Though he still walked with that ex-cop gait, shoulders squared, spine straight, his face had softened, etched less with suspicion and more with a kind of gentle wonder. Most mornings, he didn't say much when he arrived. He'd just tip his cap to the front desk and follow Orion down the hallway. The center had 3 wings, one for elderly outreach, another for children with developmental conditions, and the third, Burke's newest project, for veterans with PTSD. Orion worked in all 3, sometimes in short intervals, sometimes all morning. He seemed to know when to be near and when to simply be present. Today, in the children's wing, Orion lay beside a table where Liam, a 6-year-old boy with high-functioning autism, stacked bright red blocks into perfect vertical towers. Liam had dark curly hair and an intense gaze, the kind of boy who rarely made eye contact but always noticed everything. Most days, he wouldn't let anyone touch his toys. But today, Orion rested his paw gently against one side of the tower and waited. Liam stopped stacking. He looked at the paw, then at Orion. Slowly, carefully, he slid the last block across the table, not to the top of the tower, but toward the dog's outstretched foot. Orion didn't flinch. "Help!" Liam whispered. "He helps!" Miles, watching from a nearby chair, didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. The work was already happening. Outside, on a shaded bench beside the community garden, Miles sipped coffee from a thermos. Orion sat at his feet, chin resting on Miles's boot. "Same spot as yesterday, huh?" came a voice. Miles looked up. David Thorne, a retired Marine with a prosthetic leg and a kind smile, sat on the bench opposite him. David had rough hands and a voice like gravel, but he always carried a harmonica in his pocket and handed out peppermint candies to the staff. "He likes routine," Miles replied. David grinned. "So do we all." They watched the breeze ripple through the leaves. Children's laughter echoed faintly from inside the center. Orion's ears twitched once but didn't lift. "You ever think he's more than a dog?" David asked. Miles didn't answer right away. He looked down at Orion, then toward the wide windows where, inside, Liam was still playing. "Every day," he said. At home, Caleb had begun speaking more, at first in fragments, then in questions. His voice was quiet, his cadence unsure, but the words were there. Clara had started keeping a notebook of his phrases, the most common ones. Dog help. Found him. Safe now. She taped one of Caleb's drawings above the kitchen sink, Orion sitting beneath a tree with a child's hand reaching for his ear. It was simple, almost minimal, but carried an emotional weight that made Clara stop each time she passed it. This morning, Caleb had looked up from his cereal and said, "Can I go today?" "To the center?" Clara asked. Caleb nodded. It was the first time he'd initiated a request. Inside the center's largest room, the community event space had been rearranged. Rows of chairs, a projector screen, and a table with coffee and leaflets lined the back wall. On the flyer, "Silent Connections, Healing Through Animal Intuition," a presentation by Annie Westbrook. Annie stood near the front, reviewing her notes. She wore a soft burgundy blouse, her gray-streaked auburn hair pulled into a low ponytail. Always practical, always focused. She had been a nurse for over 15 years, but only recently had she found herself on stage instead of beside a hospital bed. Behind her, the first slide displayed a photo of Orion seated beside Robert's hospital bed. Another followed, Orion and Caleb in the same position. Different people, same posture, same quiet understanding. The audience filtered in slowly. Some were therapists, others caretakers, some just curious locals, but a few were very still, like they didn't quite know why they came, until Orion padded quietly to the stage and lay beside Annie. "Today," she began, "I want to talk about things that don't make noise." There was a long pause. When Robert Hensley went missing, it wasn't the police who found him. It was a dog. But Orion didn't just find him because of a scent trail or a trick. He found him because he remembered who Robert was, what he meant, and more importantly, what he needed. She clicked to the next slide, Caleb's drawing of the bridge. This was drawn by a child who hadn't spoken in months. He had never seen the bridge, never met Robert, but he had met Orion, and that was enough. More slides followed, data on emotional stabilization, notes from Burke's observations, charts showing reduced anxiety responses in both veterans and children after brief sessions with Orion. But it wasn't the numbers that caught people. It was the stillness in Annie's voice. The way she paused between each word, like holding space for every patient she'd ever watched, try to find themselves again. In the front row, Miles watched with arms folded. He wasn't there for recognition. He was there because Orion was. And Orion? He lay beside Annie the entire time, never once looking away from the crowd, as if waiting to be needed again. Later that evening, Miles and Orion sat in the park near the Riverwalk. The bench creaked under Miles's weight, but the view was calm. Water reflecting the pink-orange hues of dusk, the city slowing down around them. Caleb ran along the gravel path nearby, Clara walking behind him with a thermos in hand. The boy would stop occasionally, crouch beside a bush or a fallen leaf, and scribble in his pocket notebook. He had started calling it the Book of Found Things. Orion watched him, ears perked, not protective, just present. Miles leaned back, eyes half closed. "You know," he muttered, "we're not so different, you and me." Orion blinked slowly. "Both of us. Just needed something to follow, something worth showing up for." And from across the park, Caleb waved, not just at Orion, but at Miles. The morning air buzzed with a sense of quiet celebration. Sunlight fell in warm ribbons across the new facade of the center. No longer just a building tucked between red-bricked side streets of Charleston, but a space reborn with purpose. The sign above the doors now read, "The Orion Connection Center," with the O stylized as a gentle spiral, evoking both a paw print and a watchful eye. A modest crowd gathered on the grass out front, their faces illuminated not just by the light of early spring, but by something softer, something like reverence. Folding chairs had been arranged in a semicircle facing a small wooden stage adorned with garlands of wildflowers. From where he stood near the edge of the stage, Miles Corbin scanned the crowd. He had traded his usual dark flannels today for a clean white shirt, sleeves rolled up just enough to show his old Marine tattoo. His silver hair was combed back, And though he still carried the quiet tension of someone used to solving problems before they spoke, today there was ease in his shoulders. By his side, as always, was Orion, the black and tan German shepherd who had, without ever raising his voice, changed the trajectory of a town. Orion sat like a statue at Miles's heel, head high, his amber eyes calm but alert. A new collar glinted beneath his chin, silver-etched with the words, "Hope doesn't need to speak." Across the lawn, people of all ages gathered. Veterans who had been part of the therapy trials, children like Liam and Caleb, parents, therapists, nurses, teachers, and reporters. The air was filled with the murmur of greetings, soft music, and the occasional bark from one of the 5 new dogs, freshly introduced recruits into the therapy program now officially titled Orion's Path. The program had grown faster than anyone predicted. What began as a pilot became a movement, led not by corporate grants or press releases, but by something quieter, proof. The kind you could feel in the stillness between a child and a dog, in a veteran's breath, slowing beside a heartbeat not his own, in the way Orion looked at you and seemed to see past what you said, right into what you needed. Annie Westbrook stood beside the refreshments table, looking uncharacteristically polished in a cobalt blouse and slacks. She was still Annie, her auburn braid was loose and her shoes were practical, but there was pride in the way she held herself today. She had poured years of fieldwork into this place, and now it lived beyond her. Next to her stood Dr. Elijah Burke, sleeves rolled, clipboard in hand as usual. Burke looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days, but it wasn't from stress. He thrived on this sort of thing, organizing, planning, observing. He'd just finished announcing to the crowd that 5 new therapy dogs had been officially accepted into the Orion's Path initiative, each matched to a specific wing of the program. The names were posted on a small board near the entrance: Luna, Jasper, Ember, Otis, and Maple. Each dog, rescued from shelters or rehomed from closed programs, was now being trained with Orion's behavioral blueprint as the model. Their trainers weren't just handlers, they were listeners, carefully coached to recognize the unspoken cues between dogs and humans. Now it was Miles's turn to speak. He stepped up to the small podium, tapped the mic once, and exhaled. The crowd quieted. Orion stood and placed a single paw gently against the wooden edge of the stage. Miles didn't read from a paper. "I spent a good part of my life believing you had to earn the right to speak," he began. "That silence was safer. That if something didn't bark, bite, or beg, it wasn't urgent." A breeze stirred, rustling leaves behind him. But then this dog stood in the middle of a street and wouldn't move until someone listened. And lucky for me, that someone was me. A few light chuckles from the crowd. I used to be the kind of man who kept his arms crossed, his guard up. I didn't know how to fix grief, so I just didn't talk about it. I didn't know how to connect anymore without needing a reason. He looked down at Orion, whose gaze never wavered. But this dog, he taught me something I never learned on the force. Some hugs don't need arms. Some truths don't need words. Some bridges are built just by being still enough to be trusted. A pause. I was the kind of man who kept his distance. Now I understand. Some of the strongest connections in the world happen through the eyes. There was silence. The good kind. The kind that holds space. When he stepped down, the crowd applauded, not loudly, but deeply. At the reception area, guests were invited to walk through the halls of the newly completed center. Each wing had been redesigned, calming blues and greens for the pediatric spaces, earth tones and soft lighting in the veterans wing, and sunlight-filled rooms with quiet music in the elder care unit. Just inside the main entrance, above the welcome desk, hung a new painting. It was a gift from Caleb Jensen, now 14, who had spent weeks working on it in secret. The canvas was wide and warm, painted in a style both dreamy and detailed. In the center stood Orion, his eyes bright, surrounded by figures of every age and walk of life, some holding hands, some kneeling, some simply standing close. There was no text beneath the painting, just the signature, C. Jensen, the eyes between us. The image had already been digitized and chosen as the official emblem of the Orion Connection Center. It was being printed on every brochure, stitched into the corner of therapy vests, and embossed on the new visitor cards. Clara stood beside the mural, her hands in her coat pockets, watching Caleb explain each brushstroke to Liam and 2 of the new dog handlers. Her face glowed with quiet pride. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass and painting the windows in golden hues. Orion sat once more beside the fountain in the center courtyard. Miles sat on the bench beside him, a cup of tea in hand. Burke approached from behind, clipboard tucked under one arm. "You know," he said, "I keep trying to figure out how to replicate this. What made him this way?" Miles smiled. "Maybe you don't. Maybe it's not about replication." Burke raised an eyebrow. "Maybe it's about reminder," Miles continued. "He reminds people what to trust again, not just dogs, themselves." In the distance, one of the new dogs, Luna, a sandy-colored retriever with a bent ear and shy eyes, laid her head gently into a veteran's lap. The man didn't move, but his shoulders softened, and for a second, the air stilled. Orion watched it all, and somewhere deep in the soft space between instinct and understanding, the world shifted just a little. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes, they come on 4 quiet paws, with eyes that don't just look, but understand. Orion never spoke a word, yet he reminded us of something we so often forget. That healing begins not with answers, but with presence. That God doesn't always send angels with wings. Sometimes, he sends them with fur and a heartbeat steady enough to calm the storm within us. Miles thought his days of purpose were over. Caleb thought no one could hear him. And Robert believed he'd be forgotten. But through a silent creature guided not by command, but by compassion, each of them found, not just rescue, they found redemption. Maybe that's what God does best. He takes the broken and brings them together. Not with noise, but with connection. So today, if you're watching this, maybe you've been carrying something no one sees. A silent burden. An unanswered prayer. Let this story be a reminder that you are not alone, and that sometimes help comes in the most unexpected form, if we're just still enough to see it. May God bless you and your loved ones, and may He send you your own Orion when you need it most. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Leave a comment below. What's your Orion? Like this video to help spread stories of hope, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life miracles. And above all, may the Lord watch over you and everyone you love, even in the silence.